Thank you for staying with us. On Monday Special tonight, we discuss the safety of our children in school on the back of the rape allegations at Moi Girls School. And joining me now is Michael Wesonga to my left. He is the Executive Director at Cradle Kenya, which is a child's rights organization. And to my right is Amos Kaburu, who is a Senior Program Officer with Twaweza, which is an education research institute. And I thank you both for coming on the program tonight. What has this incident at Moi Girls revealed about the safety of our children in schools?
Thank you, Anne, and good evening to our viewers. Once again is to pass sincere pole sana to the Moi Girls community for what has just befallen them after 8 months of what they went through after the inferno. It's quite unfortunate that this will happen in a space of less than 1 year. It's quite unfortunate. Of course, not to the investigations which are ongoing, but I think this clearly points out to many issues around the safety of our children, and whether it's in terms of the policy process or whether indeed it's in terms of the implementation of what is expected to be the policy, because it's not the first time we've had these cases which are quite dramatic, and Kenyans or people who quite remember the incident of 1991 at the famous St. Kizito incident where more than 29 girls lost their lives. And when you look at the nature of our schools, there hasn't been so much in terms of improvement, in terms of how we think about safety. And perhaps the challenge is how we structure and how we design safety issues. That safety is not considered as a parameter or an approach that is used while we are designing educational interventions. So I think that mismatch, if you look at the Claire Omolo report of last year, that found that this safety manual implementation was just at 30% in our schools, it raises serious issues on why is it that a document after 10 years schools will be struggling to implement? Perhaps is it the issue of capacity, whether it's in terms of resources, whether it's in terms of enforcement, because we also have that challenge of enforcement. The people who are supposed to enforce are the quality assurance and standards officers. And we're talking about less than 500 officers across the country. So if you have got more than 25,000 public primary schools, more than 7,000 public secondary schools, in addition to the amelioration of all these private schools around, it becomes such a huge and daunting task in terms of just how to look at the implementation of the same. But even looking at the resourcing in terms of the resources required, because public schools are basically surviving on the purview of the resources that have been put to them. But even look at the general society at large. If we had a fire, what are Kenyans likely to do? We'll be rushing towards the direction where there is fire as opposed to running away. So I think this was the whole aspect of public education, of how we deal with matter safety, and even just our own children. How do you even able to tell that your children is going through abuse? And I'm sure Mike can share a lot of examples of what the kind of challenges they've really been going around in terms of child protection and safeguarding different contexts. Yeah,
Mike, what stands out for you as a child rights advocate?
Okay, thanks, Anne, for the invite. And we at the Cradle, which is a child rights organization, I will tell you that first thing that came to my mind when I heard of the story at Moi Girls was that no, not again, not the same place. But then you ask yourself, why do we keep having these kind of issues occurring? Because believe you me, Moi Girls is not the only place. This should be happening at so many other places. It's only that we don't get to hear of so many of them. And to me, most of it is because of there's a huge gap between policy making level and when it comes to implementation at the schools level. Because if you asked me, how many teachers are even trained on the basics of child protection? And these are the people we expect to be the custodian of our children once the children leave their parents and go into the schools. So it's basically sort of a gap between policy where it's been made and the implementation process.
All right. Yeah. And both of you, it seems like you agree that policy if you are agreeing, the policy is somewhat in the right direction but is lacking in implementation. Would that be correct, or do you think there equally is a gap between, I mean, if you were to go as far back as maybe 2008 sort of policies and subsequent years, a lot of that was informed by and large with things like fire incidents, and there was a lot of thinking towards, safety in terms of evacuating students in the case of an emergency, easy access, to schools and things like that. Do you think that policy as it stands is speaking to our modern reality and needs of safety in schools?
Thanks, Anne. The very reality that we cannot implement that policy means therefore that it's not a good policy, because a policy is as good as the extent to which it is implemented. And so you have to begin to look at the issues of design of this policy, because a policy is pretty broad because it's intertwined with the issues of the regulatory and the legal framework, because this is what is supposed to provide a framework through which something is supposed to be operationalized. And this is basically answering the 5 questions: what, when, where, how, and basically why. So if a policy does not address these kind of realities, we have to look at the context how this policy was developed. Of course, it was a rushed process. So by now we should even be looking at how we need to audit and look at, are there aspects within this policy that we find that cannot necessarily work. And I want to draw a parallel to one of the policies that has been very strong in the ministry, and that is the SNE policy, how to identify children with living with disabilities within the school context, how we screen and how we diagnose them. And the approach which we use is what you call a multidisciplinary approach, that you do not need an ophthalmologist within the school for you to tell that children have a problem. You can basically conduct some routine checks, which are basically screening, and then you're able to take where you identify that there are particular challenges which are very, very generalized. You can now bring in the specialists. This is the same approach that we need to take. This policy, this manual was basically developed by the Church World Service. And now you see there are a lot of players. If you look at the kind of work that Cradle is doing, if you look at the kind of work UNICEF is doing, and other partners, Plan International, who are doing a lot of work around safety in our schools, it's really be good now to look at it and ask ourselves, what are the specific things that we need perhaps to consider when we are addressing these issues? Number 2
is sorry, to just be more specific, does something glare out at you as being completely lacking? I know you've talked about even resources to implement some of these policies, and whether that makes the policy bad or just means we need to inject more resources is a separate matter. But is there something that sticks out at you, like, we haven't covered this, we haven't thought about this when protecting our children? Yes,
it's a big problem that you design the policy without understanding who is going to implement it. Because as he clearly put it, the burden of responsibility lies with the teachers. So if you do not prepare these teachers adequately for them to implement the policy, then it becomes a big problem. And the people who are supposed to ensure that it's being implemented, who are the quality assurance and standards officers, are not there. On average, it takes about 4 years for a school to be visited by the quality assurance standards officers. So it becomes very difficult for schools to implement the provisions of this particular policy.
Okay, just to add something from a child rights perspective, and you ask yourself, what during the preparation of all these policies that we are talking about, did we involve each and every of the stakeholder? Were the children even involved in the whole of this process? How many, for example, of the teachers were involved in its formulation process? Or is it a case whereby some group of experts sat down as consultants, developed this, and then later on handed it over now to people at the school level who are supposed to implement it, and they totally have no idea what they're supposed to be implementing? Maybe that's one of the reasons.
Because the stakeholders just saying know what their needs are.
Yes, that's exactly what happened, because this document was developed in less than 2 months. Because I remember very well there was a lot of incidents of strikes within the school, and within 2 months the minister by then, Professor Ongeri, came up with the document and said, here it is now, schools, you should start implementing it.
But policies aside, I mean, for parents who are watching this program, is the safety of their children completely in the hands of the school and the administration and the ministry? You send out your child to boarding, do you sort of just leave it to the gods for their safety, or is there a way in which perhaps parents should be more involved in a process that is being owned, even like you've said it in policy, separately somewhere else, and not really taking the front seat and saying, look, these are the bare minimums for our children in school?
Definitely, the parents have a responsibility. And when we refer to these multiple of these documents, the safety standards talks about 13 areas. Child-friendly schools talks about 6 components. If you look at the circular from TSC, identifies about 7 areas. So you need to look at them and see where do you demarcate the responsibilities that come with the different stakeholders. As a parent, you clearly have got what you're supposed to do. And if you look at 2 years ago, we're dealing with a case of Mount Elgon where in one school, a teacher impregnated 28 girls in one school. And you begin asking yourself, all these things happened, the girls never told their parents what was happening. So there are certain components that parents need to be looking out for, and that's why we need what I say, that multiple approach, whether it means having this conversation in churches, whether it means in where we stay, so that we're able to identify the different components when it comes to safety around sexual issues. How do we address what is supposed to go into our children? When we talk about the physical movement, we remember the case of Mombasa last year where a child dropped from a school bus. These are issues of physical security. And what is it that schools just have in place? Last week, if I give a clear-cut example, last week on Friday, I was called from school that my daughter was rushing to the school van just to be the first one, and she ended up falling down, and the school had to take immediate action, including calling me as the first thing before they could do anything else. So you will even see that private schools are a little bit faster in terms of how they think about safety compared to our public schools. So there is so much that parents are supposed to do, just being aware of what are these safety issues when it comes, for instance, to issues of emotional abuse. And Mike will tell you that when you're talking about school, when we're talking about issues of child protection, we talk about components of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and even any other form of abuse that we really need to protect children when we're talking about such.
But you hear in some of these public schools, you know, people saying, you know, they wonder, and a lot of commentary from the public has been, you know, you wonder how an outside attacker would get in when a parent is not even able to access the school to see their child. You know, they have to sort of do it from the grills and the gates. So in cases where schools are so rigid sometimes in terms of how they administrate, how can parents really just own that space? I am the parent and I want to be involved and know what security arrangements, etc. are, so that the decisions are not being made away from them. Okay,
let me respond to that by maybe giving an example of what just happened the other day. When you got the news of what had happened at the school, we actually went to Moi Girls. And the first thing when we arrived at the school, it was sort of a struggle trying to get into the school. And I remember asking one of the security guards, if only you are serious the way you are now treating me. If only you treated the confines of this school the same way you are treating me now, those alleged attackers wouldn't have made their way into the school. When it comes, and those are the kind of issues that parents deal with every now and again. Got to talk to so many parents at that same place, and they were talking of situations whereby a school has a PTA chairman whose daughter finished school 8 years ago. So what business does such a parent still have to run the affairs of the current parents and the current students? So many, and it's not a case that is unique to these particular schools. These are cases that you find well spread throughout the country. It's a double standard. It's a double standard kind of a situation where there's sort of like there's no cohesion between the school management and maybe the parents on the other side. So when it comes to cases of taking care of the children, then there seem to be people pulling from different directions, and you end up with so many sad situations. This week alone, we've had the case of a 6-year-old boy was beaten by his teachers in Nyandarua. Today, just at the reception, I was reading a story of another girl who was allegedly defiled by her teacher. In Mbita constituency, Rusinga girls, there's a story, a similar story, just in a span of 1 week. And those are the only ones that the media has had to report. So we can imagine how many of these other cases of child abuse are going on in our schools or other learning institutions without being reported.
But let me put it this way, how do parents, because of the double standard that you have talked about, how do parents hold these schools accountable when at the same time, you know, the competition to get into some of these schools is just so fierce that almost leaves a parent at in a disadvantaged or begging position where, you know, you want your child to go to this school, it's a prize school, etc. But and in a sense that kind of robs the parent of the power that they can exercise in terms of holding schools accountable. What would you tell parents to do right now if they're concerned about, you know, their children in school?
I think there is that general narrative that there is very little that parents can do, but I do not think that that is true, because you look at some of the recommendations in this manual, and one of them is that schools are supposed to set up what they call school safety committees, and this is a committee that will be made of different stakeholders, particularly the children and the teaching staff. And one of the approaches that we have seen to be very, very effective is some kind of work we're doing in Uganda with UNICEF, which is called the Safe Schools Initiative. And it basically involves drawing the map of the school and identifying the areas that are particularly, maybe children are not very comfortable around them, identifying maybe if there are particular individuals that they are not quite comfortable around the school, because as he put it, this is first of all the safety of the children. And the children are able to tell you what goes on right and what does not go wrong. Number two is to use the available spaces and opportunities, because we have meetings such as the annual general meetings that parents are usually called to school, and this is a very good forum and very good opportunity for parents to find out what is happening. You'll be shocked, and that a large number of our parents, including even where I educate myself, even people have no idea what kind of classroom their children learn in. So you go to schools where a parent has no idea how the four corners of a classroom sit, because all they wait for is that they go to that particular school, they sit on the pitch, they eat the food that they have brought for their children during visiting day. But asking schools just to be accountable, I really want to know, where is it that my child sleeps, where is it that my child learns. We have visited a number of schools, including just the vicinity of where we are here, and you'll be shocked if you walked into those schools. So it is not actually asking for too much. It's quite important, because the safety of your child is much more important. It's better for you to ask and be vilified rather than later on to be called and asked that now come and pick the corpse of your daughter or your son. It's very, very important.
Should the security of schools, and in particular boarding schools, because that is what is on the spot, be entirely left to school administration, or to what extent do you believe national government plays a role? And if you would be specific.
I think the national government should play a very big role, because first of all, education is not entirely devolved. That is one thing. And two, the reason I feel the Ministry of Interior per se should actually get involved in this, because I'll give an example of Moi Girls. Look at the location of the school, for example. It is a tough job for the few security personnel who are employed by the school to even... I went to the school, and I was being told of the entire dormitory area is being patrolled by 1 or 2 security guards. This is a school with almost 1,000 students. And I don't think most schools would have the capacity to ensure that kind of security. The memo you just talked about from the NAT Secretary General, that is insisting on particular kind of requirements, unless much more investment is given to the schools. Remember, even painting the buses, changing the colors to yellow was a struggle to most schools. So you can imagine, when you now tell the schools that now you need to have CCTV cameras, you need to have razor wires, you need to have your schools. How will a school, for example, somewhere in Rusinga Island, for example, be able to afford that, unless we really put in so much? I don't think it's going to be possible for the schools.
And let me just refer to that, because I think we talked about that off the air. Wilson Sossion has written a memo to the Ministry of Education saying that, amongst other things, CCTV, trained security personnel, not the odd guard, but trained security personnel, secured perimeters, alarm bells, and so on, should be a bare minimum in schools. Do you agree that those are bare minimums?
They could or they could not be. I would be more careful with a more pragmatic approach, and which is, first of all, how do we work with the existing resources that we have? And first of all, what do we need to have everyone in our school be trained on? And number two, what is the mechanism of escalating where there are safety concerns? For instance, what happened in this school? If at all the allegations are true that the matron could not basically wake up, were there other mechanisms perhaps escalating the issue? If there was, for instance, an alarm bell, could it have actually have gone off, that it would be escalated and there would be a hotline that anyone would have used to call and bring in the security forces and such? I think these are issues that you not necessarily to ensure that there is a policeman in every school, because for a fact, we cannot afford to employ, and this one I'm speaking authoritatively, we cannot afford to employ a policeman for every single school in this country, because if we try to deploy security personnel into every school, we are going to already to deplete the already overstretched resources by close to 15%. So, and it's not going to work, because it's just like in every neighborhood, you can't afford to have every policeman rotating here and there. So the second thing we have to think of is a model that was being proposed by the UN Habitat, which is what is called the school community approach. How can also the communities that live around the school become more proactive in terms of providing adequate support to these schools? It's important that schools are very, very sensitive. We do not want to encourage loss of walk-in and loss of walk-out. But in the unfortunate event that something is happening in the school, how can the neighboring community come in very, very fast to also provide any kind of support that we need? So I will be more cautious and advise that we need to take a more pragmatic approach, as opposed to some of these very hard positions by just saying that we need to make sure that everyone is, we need to make sure there are 3 policemen, there are CCTV cameras. What about supposing electricity has gone off and you do not have mechanism for those CCTVs to happen? Because we have seen even instances where last year some students, the first thing they did was to disconnect power, they disconnected water, they created a buffer using petrol, then they were able now to bombard the school and end up torching down close to 11 hostels. So I think going back really to working with safety committees within the schools and do routine risk assessments, that perhaps when you look at this time, what are likely to be the risks? Perhaps there will be a lot of stress that is coming, perhaps with the mock examinations. When we look at the Form 2s, there's some kind of excitement. When you look at sports coming in, there's likelihood that drugs will be coming. And then now if we're able to think about mechanisms that we really need to put in place. So it's just a question of really sounding up the schools to be very, very sensitive to what is happening. But I think one of the fundamentals also to address is we really need to rethink about our schools the way they are. There is a lot of stress happening in our schools, and when you look at our boarding schools, one time I was here and I was quoted saying that some of our schools look like almost prisons, because children are supposed to wake up at 5, children are going to sleep past midnight. So children are so much frustrated. So how can we make sure that schools are look a little bit habitable and children are feel free to be able to air out what are their concerns, what is particularly happening? We are dealing with youngsters who are able to collect a lot of information. So we should not just dismiss them altogether, but now find more mechanisms how to make our schools to be more habitable than they are right now.
Just to add something on what he has just said, as part of our operations at the Cradle, whenever we are dealing with issues involving children, we always ensure that psychosocial support is a very big component of it, just so that kids are prepared psychologically for any eventuality, which again I'm not sure if most schools, for example, have put psychosocial support as part of their programs in dealing with the kids. It's more of a carrot and stick kind of a thing. You either do this way or we deal with you this way. But you see, these are totally different generation of kids that the carrot and stick might never easily work with them.
That's unfortunately all the time we had, but I thank you both for your views, and of course we'll stay following the developments at the school, with the DCI having ordered that all male personnel within the school undergo DNA testing. So keep it Citizen TV. Of course, we'll have updates in subsequent bulletins. That's our time tonight on Monday Special. Thank you for watching. I am Ann Kiguta. Good night. God bless.